Okay, great. Why don't we get started? So I'm Professor Glenn Cohen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the latest iteration of our amazing seminar series. This is a joint production between ourselves at the Petrie-Flom Center and our friends at the Solomon Center at Yale Law School. We couldn't be more thrilled to be working together on this important issue. Today's session focuses on biotech, and I wanted to start by thanking the staffs at both center who put together this in a seamless and amazing way. So here's the order of operations. We're going to start with a very, and I do mean very brief introduction of the people who are going to be speaking and the order in which they are going to be speaking. Then we will have them present each for about 15 minutes. We'll then move to Q&A, and we ask you to use the Q&A function, not the chat function, to pose questions from which I'll select. You may also participate via Twitter, and we'll have information about the hashtag out for you, and you can find us on Twitter under the Petrie-Flom account. So without further ado, let me get started. Our first speaker today is going to be Rachel Sachs. She's an associate professor of law at the Washington University in St. Louis School of Law. She's going to present work that's co-authored with Lisa Willett, Nicholson Price, and Jake Shirkow. After her, we're going to hear from Catherine Van Tassel, who is a visiting professor of law at the Law and Medicine Center at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and her co-author on the paper she's going to be presenting is Sharona Hoffman. We'll then hear from Govind Prasad, who's an assistant professor at the Sturm College of Law, and Michael Sinha, who is a research fellow at the Harvard-MIT Center for Regulatory Science. And Michael's partner on his papers are friends of ours from Sibyl in Copenhagen, Timo Minson, and Sven Boston. So with those introductions, Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we're really excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Glenn, for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers at the Petrie-Flom and Solomon Centers for putting on such a wonderful event. So this chapter, Innovation Law and COVID-19, Promoting Incentives and Access for New Healthcare Technologies, as Glenn mentioned, is joint work with my fantastic co-authors. And our focus in this chapter is on how the innovation architecture behind COVID-19 both encouraged and impeded the development and allocation of new technologies in the fight against the virus, and provides lessons on how innovation incentives might be better deployed for future pandemics. We consider three main themes in the area of innovation policy and how examples from COVID-19 help illuminate the flaws in our innovation institutions, but also illustrate their promise. Before we go on, I do want to note that since the beginning of the pandemic, the four of us have been working on a series of blog posts about these questions. So far, we've published 31 blog posts and counting. So if you're interested in learning more about a number of these specific topics, I'd encourage you to check out Lisa's blog at writtendescription.blogspot.com, although many of our posts have also been cross-posted at the Petrie-Flom Center's Bill of Health. So the first theme our chapter considers is the role of interagency coordination in the innovation process. And as an example, we consider the development and rollout of diagnostic testing for COVID-19. A robust diagnostic testing system is essential to identify where the virus is spreading and to enable public health officials to implement appropriate mitigation efforts. But failures of interagency coordination, especially early on in the pandemic, led to delays in the development of testing capacity in the US. And in January 2020, as public health agencies began to learn more about the virus, the CDC developed its own diagnostic test and began to share test kits with state public health labs. But a problem with the kits was soon discovered, causing the CDC to tell states to stop using the kits. For more than a month, the CDC wasn't able to solve the problem. The FDA should have been able to help, but often the agencies were at odds with each other. At one point, the CDC even blocked an FDA official from entering the CDC to try to help address the problems. For its part, the FDA wasn't able to quickly clear diagnostic tests that could have filled the void left by the CDC, and independent lab certification requirements overseen by CMS also limited the set of labs eligible to do COVID diagnostic testing. Interagency coordination between these agencies, the Centers for Disease Control, Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, that could have mitigated these delays. Even if the agencies didn't work together on their own, they all share a parent agency in HHS. HHS Secretary Azar could have taken steps to identify conflicts between the agencies and help accelerate the diagnostic development process. But reports suggested that he, quote, blocked efforts, unquote, to allow private labs to obtain testing approval in the CDC's absence and waited to address testing issues until the end of February. Administration officials referred in the press to his conduct as a management failure, noting that CDC and FDA should have been working hand in hand. So establishing strong norms of interagency coordination can help avoid harms like these and others that have arisen during the pandemic. Different policymakers have different tools for encouraging collaboration, and different strategies may be useful depending on the situation involved. So Congress can encourage interagency collaboration either by requiring it or even just by signaling that it's an important policy goal. So as one example, Congress has instructed the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, to report annually on their activities involving collaboration with other agencies within HHS. Congress has required this reporting as a way of encouraging the NIH to increase its interagency collaborations, but most of the collaborations themselves are not mandated. The relevance of organizational structure here, you can imagine more top-down methods of forcing interagency collaboration, either through HHS as the parent agency or as the White House, where a whole of government response is needed. And as I'll mention in a few minutes, in the vaccine context, a White House-led initiative, Operation Warp Speed, was effective in driving innovation in the vaccine technology context. And then finally, in general, it's easier to foster new interagency collaborations if there's already a culture of collaboration within each agency. The more collaborations there are, the more potential channels there are for communicating potential interagency challenges going forward. Our second theme is on the ways in which the FDA is typically called upon to strike a balance in terms of the speed with which the agency can approve a new product and the level of evidence before the agency about whether that product is safe and effective. And during the pandemic, the FDA has been called upon to make decisions on the basis of very little evidence, sometimes in ways that jeopardized the development of future evidence on a topic. So one of the many emergency declarations made by the administration enabled the FDA to use its emergency powers to grant emergency use authorizations for products for which it is, quote, reasonable to believe that they, quote, may be effective in treating COVID-19. And the agency's authority here is discretionary. The agency may grant such an authorization under the statute, but the agency did use these powers to authorize the use of many products for the treatment of COVID-19. And in the chapter, we present hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma as contrasting cases. They both involved quite a bit of apparent political pressure, but putting that aside, there are reasons to be encouraged about the way in which the hydroxychloroquine EUA was granted and to be concerned about the convalescent plasma EUA. When the FDA issued the hydroxychloroquine EUA, it knew that several studies of the drug's use against COVID-19 were ongoing and would soon be completed, providing the agency with the ability to quickly review their initial authorization. Those studies quickly showed that the drug was not effective against COVID-19, and the agency reevaluated its decision, revoking the EUA less than 3 months after it was granted. By contrast with convalescent plasma, there was an existing expanded access program for convalescent plasma, which may have made it more difficult for researchers to complete the required clinical trials. This is a brief excerpt from a New York Times article about convalescent plasma from early August, weeks before the FDA granted an EUA for the product. It was known that, quote, many patients and their doctors, knowing they could get the treatment under the expanded access program, have been unwilling to join clinical trials that might provide them with a placebo instead of the plasma. This was known, but the FDA nevertheless granted the EUA, and it does not appear that they had pre-committed plans to revisit the data at issue. Just 2 weeks ago, the FDA narrowed its existing EUA to limit the use of convalescent plasma after evidence came out suggesting that it may not be as effective as it was publicly claimed in August. So in our view, even when the agency is prioritizing speed under pandemic conditions, policymakers should ensure that the FDA is considering the impact of its access decisions on its ability to generate high-quality clinical trial data to confirm or reject preliminary evidence of safety and efficacy. This is important precisely because it's difficult and expensive to generate good information on the safety and efficacy of new products, especially once products are already on the market. So we propose 2 strategies for assisting the FDA in this process. So first, the agency should consider releasing clear statements about future triggers for EUA expansion, revocation, or modification. For instance, certain efficacy signals leading to expansion or safety signals leading to revocation, but also how much evidence must be generated. This is likely to be more effective, we acknowledge, with products whose sponsors stand to gain from the treatment remaining on the market and to lose from its removal. So this applies more clearly to the vaccine manufacturers, for instance, but for products made by many entities like hydroxychloroquine, which is generic, or convalescent plasma, which doesn't have a traditional manufacturer in the same way, the incentives are somewhat more diffuse. Second, though, government investment could make information generation less costly so that the incentives to generate it don't need to be as strong. Research grants can support the cost of clinical trials, and reducing the cost of generating higher quality observational data could also help. Our third theme is about properly rewarding and incentivizing vaccine developers. It's a common theme in the literature that we underinvest in vaccine development for various reasons, and that this undermines our pandemic preparedness efforts. But in the context of COVID-19, effective vaccines reach the public in record time. Both Pfizer, Biotech, and Moderna received EUAs from the FDA in December 2020, less than a year after those candidates entered the development process. There are a number of factors which contributed to this success, including getting lucky with the science and interagency collaboration, as I mentioned earlier. But the investment of very large amounts of money and other public resources is a critical part of the answer as well. So the Trump administration quickly established a whole of government initiative, Operation Warp Speed, with the goal of speeding these candidates to market. And the support provided by Warp Speed to Pfizer, Moderna, and many other manufacturers was both financial and logistical. So Warp Speed provided financial support to vaccine candidates in 2 ways. First, by encouraging at-risk manufacturing, and second, by securing advanced purchases of the resulting vaccines. Moderna, which had never brought a product to market before, they accepted up to $483 million in funding in April 2020 to support the scale up of their manufacturing efforts and the completion of their late-stage clinical trials. Pfizer, already one of the world's largest vaccine manufacturers, did not accept this funding. But Warp Speed also provided billions in financial support, including to both Pfizer and Moderna in the form of advanced purchase commitments of vaccines. So by mid-August 2020, Warp Speed had already pre-purchased 800 million doses from 6 developers, including 100 million doses from Moderna for milestone payments up to 1.5 billion, and 100 million doses from Pfizer for 1.95 billion. That's now gone up to 300 million doses of each more recently, just in the last few weeks. This model isn't completely novel. So Gavi's $1.5 billion advanced market commitment for a pneumococcal vaccine had been used to spur development and dissemination of that product, which has now resulted in the vaccination of over 150 million children in low-income countries. But for those who are more interested in the differences between the 2 models, we have a series of posts on our on Lisa's blog about this topic. Properly rewarding vaccine developers and distributors during the pandemic is important not only for controlling this pandemic, but also for being better prepared for the next one. So first and most importantly, policymakers should do what they can to increase public funding for vaccine R&D and to increase incentives for private funding. Research on vaccines for diseases with pandemic potential has enormous social value, but the vaccine sector has been plagued by both political and market failures. And so hopefully rewards like those set by Warp Speed for these private investments and the salience of the costs of an unchecked pandemic will help spur greater public and private investment going forward. And then second, we hope the COVID-19 experience broadens conventional understandings of the policy playbook for promoting access to medicines. Whether they're out-of-pocket costs paid by patients is an entirely separate question from the financial rewards for developers. Vaccines can and should be free to patients even if developers receive enormous financial rewards, and advocates should think about policies that would reduce patient costs while still ensuring sufficient rewards to companies, including different types of delinkage policies. Great, so thank you so much.
I think we're going to transition directly into our next speaker.
Hello, everyone. Glenn, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you all for inviting me to speak today. I'm very pleased to talk with you today about the paper that I've co-authored with Professor Sharona Hoffman of the Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Our paper analyzes how the vaccine injury compensation system that operates during public health emergencies can exacerbate health and economic disparities. Along with Carmel Shashar, Professor Hoffman and I also recently published a much shorter piece on this issue in the New England Journal of Medicine. Collectively, our work argues that the potential for vaccine-related harms raises acute concerns for vulnerable populations. These harms have a disparate impact on low-income people who are disproportionately non-white and who have limited financial resources to obtain medical care, weather job losses, and pursue injury compensation. When a vaccine is given as a countermeasure during a declared public health emergency, this problem is acute because of the limited availability of injury compensation. In my presentation today, I will summarize the two existing mechanisms to which injured parties can turn for a remedy: the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, also known as the VICP, which applies to most vaccines given in the US, and the far less generous and less accessible Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, also known as the CICP, which applies to vaccinations given as countermeasures during public health emergencies. I will also describe the health and financial disparities suffered by vulnerable populations during a pandemic and its aftermath, and how these disparities are intensified by the CICP. I will wrap up by sharing with you our proposals for legal reforms to the injury compensation and vaccine approval processes that aim to protect the disadvantaged and enhance equity. Most importantly, we advocate for an entirely new vaccine fast-track approval process called the Emergency Vaccine Development System for use during a declared public health emergency. Through the 1918 flu, Hurricane Katrina, and the H1N1 pandemic, history teaches that the poor and communities of color shouldered the greatest burden of disease, death, and loss, both during and after public health disasters. Over the past year, it has quickly become clear that the COVID pandemic is no different. Racial and ethnic minorities are more than twice as likely to die from the virus as white people. And high poverty areas have strikingly increased COVID-19 mortality rates. Multiple factors generate these disparities. For example, disadvantaged populations suffer from higher rates of pre-existing conditions, such as asthma, heart disease, and diabetes. They are also adversely affected by what we are known as the social determinants of health, including low wage employment, reliance on public transportation, and food and housing insecurity. All of these contribute to a cascading effect that results in higher mortality and morbidity related to COVID-19. For low-income and minority communities, these same vulnerabilities mean that the long-term effects of a pandemic can be devastating and can delay their recovery from a pandemic's financial and health impacts until long after the public health crisis has passed for the rest of the country. The double jeopardy of health and financial risk that they face means that there is an acute need to vaccinate these populations rapidly. Yet those who most need vaccination are also just one serious vaccine injury away from financial injury and ruin. Which brings us to our current problem. As most of you listening today are likely to now know, ordinarily it takes 10 years to develop a vaccine. This slow pace of development is why vaccines have traditionally been very safe. The good news is that pharma worked to have emergency approval of several vaccines in only a matter of months pursuant to Operation Warp Speed. With 30,000 to 60,000 people enrolled in clinical trials, the majority of these vaccines' common side effects that occurred shortly after vaccination were identified. The bad news is that this short timeline provided no opportunity to identify potential adverse events that might occur in the longer term or that are rare enough that we are only just starting to discover them as the vaccine is being distributed to a substantial portion of the public. Thus, people in high-risk communities face a difficult dilemma: risk becoming infected or risk of vaccine injury. The case of the National Swine Flu Immunization Program is instructive. In 1976, the federal government decided to protect the public from swine flu and quickly advanced the administration of the vaccine. 50 million vaccines were given in just a few months. Unfortunately, 450 vaccinated people developed Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare and serious neurological disorder that can result in muscle weakness and paralysis. The program was quickly suspended, but the harm was done. It triggered an enduring public mistrust of flu vaccinations and often appears as part of the narrative of the anti-vaccination movement. This is where the VICP would normally come into play. The VICP covers most vaccines routinely given in the United States. This no-fault program was created to provide an alternative legal system to ensure quick and fair compensation for vaccine injuries, and to insulate vaccine manufacturers from liability to encourage them to pursue vaccine development. For many types of vaccine injuries, if a claimant has symptoms within a certain time, causation is presumed, leaving only the extent of damages in question. Successful claims and attorney's fees are paid out of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Trust Fund, which is currently valued at about $4 billion. Unfortunately, during a declared public health emergency, injured parties will not be eligible for the VICP. The Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, commonly called the PrEP Act, mandates that individuals injured by a vaccine can bring claims only under the CICP. Under the CICP, individuals can only file a claim for 1 year after they are vaccinated, regardless of when their symptoms appear or are determined to be associated with the vaccine. This deadline is particularly draconian in the way that it applies to pregnant women. A woman who is vaccinated when she is just 1 month pregnant will have only a handful of months after her baby is born to discover that her baby was injured and file a claim. The CICP only compensates serious injuries that require hospitalization or cause disabling injuries. It also has a higher burden of proof than the VICP. Causation must be based on compelling, reliable, valid medical and scientific evidence, a standard that will be difficult to meet as the science around RNA technologies that the current COVID vaccines rely upon is in its infancy. The CICP also denies any compensation for pain, suffering, and emotional distress, as well as for attorney's fees and costs. There is no opportunity to appeal claim denials in court. It's important to understand that persons vaccinated during a public health emergency can never pursue any vaccine injury claims under the VICP, even if their symptoms appear long after the emergency declaration is over. The U.S. is currently distributing the vaccine in tiers, starting with healthcare and other essential workers, and those most at risk. Members of these groups who have agreed to be vaccinated quickly will be limited to CICP claims. On the other hand, those who can afford to wait for the declared public health emergency to be over before being vaccinated will be able to file their claims for any injuries under the far more robust VICP. For lower income workers, including many essential workers, delaying vaccination until the end of the declared public health emergency would be especially dangerous. These workers are often at high risk for infection because of their close contact with other people at their workplaces. At the same time, low-income people who most need to be vaccinated are also the least able to weather the health and financial outcomes of a serious vaccine injury, especially if the CICP is their only option for compensation. By contrast, people who can afford to wait for vaccination until an emergency declaration has ended will tend to be more privileged. This group will probably consist largely of people who can work remotely and socially isolate until they feel confident about the vaccine's safety profile. They tend to be disproportionately well-educated, high earners, and white. Excuse me. If those with socioeconomic advantages choose to wait for vaccines while their working class counterparts cannot, they may be compensated far more liberally for the same types of vaccine injuries. Differences between the VICP and the CICP could therefore reinforce long-established inequities rooted in income, race, and ethnic identity. Complicating this situation is that the absence of VICP injury compensation could further undermine vulnerable populations' trust in government's current efforts to vaccinate them quickly. People who are already the most leery of vaccination are some of those who are at most risk of serious harm from the virus. Black Americans account for almost 1/4 of all COVID-19 deaths, but almost half report they probably will not or definitely will not get vaccinated, compared to around 1/3 of white respondents. Many Black Americans are suspicious of governmental and medical authorities and are not receptive to their public health messaging. The infamous Tuskegee study, a medical experiment that withheld treatment from Black men with syphilis, continues to cast a long shadow. The absence of VICP injury compensation could further undermine vulnerable populations' trust in the government and vaccines for generations to come. The negative impact on trust is a critical consideration because this compensation problem is not limited to the current pandemic, but will repeat itself in future public health disasters that involve infectious diseases. Experts opine that the likelihood of future pandemics is increasing. Many believe that the next pandemic is likely to be right around the corner. So what should be done? In order to rectify the inequities propagated by the CICP, we propose two alternative solutions. First and most simply, Congress could amend the PrEP Act to create a carve-out for all vaccines approved during a pandemic so that they can immediately be added to the VICP. This carve-out for vaccines approved during a public health emergency is justified, as vaccines are given to healthy people for the good of society to protect the collective, while drugs and devices approved under an emergency use approval are provided to unhealthy people to treat and cure their individual illnesses. This carve-out for vaccines would not impact any other countermeasures that have an EUA. In the alternative, we offer a more ambitious proposal. Congress should amend the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to create an entirely new vaccine fast-track approval process called the Emergency Vaccine Development System, or EVDS. This proposal would provide vulnerable populations with a more comprehensive protection because it addresses not only injury compensation, but also minority underrepresentation at the clinical trial stage. This new process would replace emergency use approvals for vaccines and would be used only during public health emergencies. A key element is that vaccines approved through this new process would automatically be included in the VICP rather than the CICP. To gain approval under this new process, drug manufacturers would need to take a list of steps that we have outlined fully in our chapter. I will just cover two of these steps. First, manufacturers will need to ensure that a sufficient number of individuals from at-risk categories such as Black Americans, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Hispanics, and older adults are included in clinical trials to create appropriate safety and efficacy profiles for vulnerable groups of potential vaccine recipients. This will be beneficial because currently there is no legal requirement for enrollment of vulnerable population in clinical trials. A JAMA study published just last week relating specifically to vaccine trials confirmed that Black Americans, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Hispanics, and older adults were significantly underrepresented in vaccine studies completed over the past 9 years. Addressing minority underrepresentation in clinical trials through the EVDS will provide vital safety data and likely help ameliorate vaccine hesitancy in these groups. Some have expressed concern that this type of mandate might delay vaccine trials during a public health emergency, as did happen in the COVID-19 clinical trials. In order to address this problem, EVDS legislation will require that the Health and Human Services Department establish and maintain a privacy-protected online registry of clinical trial volunteers similar to the organ donor registry. This measure will ensure that an adequate number of people of all races and ethnicities and ages are immediately available to participate in clinical trials when a public health crisis emerges. Like organ donors and those registering to vote, clinical trial participants should be able to sign up when they renew their driver's licenses. Our proposed new vaccine approval process will also require that the FDA establish a unified set of clinical trial benchmarks and endpoints to be followed by all vaccine manufacturers. These shared endpoints and benchmarks will allow minorities with different risk profiles to differentiate and choose among different vaccines based on sound safety and effectiveness data. During a crisis, multiple competing vaccines could be approved, and there is no current system to identify preferred vaccines. Facilitating informed decision-making is important for vulnerable populations and for all Americans. In conclusion, even the most carefully developed and tested vaccine can lead to injuries. These injuries can disproportionately affect vulnerable populations who are most at need of vaccinations, but also at risk of financial ruin if harmed by a vaccine. Both of our proposals will promote both public health goals and enhanced equity by ensuring that vaccines are covered by the VICP rather than the CICP. Our new vaccine approval process will also improve the vaccine study process. It will ensure that sufficient data is generated from clinical trials to allow the vulnerable to make informed vaccination choices and mitigate their vaccine hesitancy. Thank you all very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions after the presentations.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And we're going to move right on to our next speaker.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Glenn. I'm just going to share my screen to share some of the slides that I'll present. Yeah, so this project, unlike the others, is a little bit of an intermediate place. I was originally supposed to author something collaboratively with Professor Sam Bagenstos from Michigan, focusing on some of our work on disability and prioritization. But he has, I think, fortunately for the country, but unfortunately for me, been appointed to a position of the Biden administration that he doesn't have time to work on that project now. So instead, I'm going to present some more general themes, one or more of which is going to ripen into the article that you end up seeing in the volume. So let me start with the two questions I'm going to focus on today in the talk. The first is, what ethical values matter when allocating treatments for COVID-19? So critical care interventions that were prominent at the start of the pandemic, like ICU beds or ventilators, allocating therapeutics, for instance, the monoclonal antibody therapies, and allocating, most prominently right now, allocating vaccines. So the first question is about values, and then the second question is about realizing those values. So how should we implement policies that try to practically realize those ethical values? And my suggestion is that there are essentially two relevant ethical values here that sometimes align and sometimes conflict. And you see these values developed in different ways, for instance, in the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices framework, the National Academy's framework for vaccines, other frameworks for things like critical care interventions. So the first value that often is discussed is the idea of maximizing benefits and minimizing harms. And you might ask two questions about this value. The first, which I'll talk about next, is which benefits and which harms count? And the second that we might think about is, are we thinking just about direct benefits of a given policy of allocation, or also about indirect benefits, the effects on others if one person receives, say, a vaccine or a therapy? The other value, sort of broadly, is a value of equity, of treating people fairly. The ACIP talks about justice in allocation as one of the values. I think there are two different ways this might be interpreted, and here I'll editorialize a bit more than with the prior one. I think some have argued that what equity should be about is about treating people in a way that's sort of facially identical or the same. I think this is not the best way of understanding equity as sameness. Instead, it's better to understand equity in the form of some kind of priority to people who are worse off in the pandemic. And the question is what it means to be worse off in what dimension. So the first value I'll talk about first, different types of harms we might prevent. So one that I think has been most prominently talked about is the idea of various pandemic interventions serving to prevent deaths or to save lives. So people sometimes argue that the only objective of COVID-19 allocation policies should be saving the most lives. I think that's too simple, but I think there's a lot of agreement that that's clearly an important objective. Another objective that is often talked about that I think is more controversial, but in some ways is also entailed by the idea of preventing deaths. Everybody's going to die at some point. The question is, when we prevent a death, we're really moving that death further into the future. So we're preventing the loss of future years of life. And one question is, should we take that into consideration when developing these policies? A third thing we might think about, especially given unknowns about long-term effects of COVID-19 beyond just death, is preventing long-term illness. And we might think about hospitalizations prevented maybe as a proxy both for that and for preventing other kinds of strain on the health system. The last factor we might think about is something that I think ACIP called preservation of societal functioning. I think in some ways that undersells that objective. If you preserve societal functioning, say by ensuring that important social services are able to keep working, indirectly you see lives saved. That's most prominent in some developing countries, for instance, where because the pandemic slowed down childhood immunization or malaria response measures, you actually got a lot of indirect harm from the pandemic that at sometimes almost seemed to outstrip the direct harm. But it's important to think about that not just as something that kind of inherently matters, but indirectly is going to lead to, if you preserve societal functioning, preventing death, saving lives in other ways. So turning now to implementation of this idea of benefit maximization, if you're focusing on direct benefits, you might look at people who are likely to gain the most in terms of benefit. People sometimes have said, you know, if you just want to maximize benefits, that means you should give ventilators to people who are the most healthy. That's not correct, I think, because if you're just looking, even if you're just looking to maximize benefits, even if you're not even thinking yet about equity, you want to look at people who would be likely to have bad outcomes if they didn't get a ventilator, but good outcomes if they do. So if you get people who are too sick, they won't have good outcomes if they get it. If you get people who are too healthy, they'll have good outcomes whether or not you give them this intervention. So for both critical care and therapies, you need to figure out that sort of sweet spot in terms of benefit maximization, where there's substantial risk, but also a substantial prospective benefit. For vaccines, it's a little bit different because for vaccines, you want to look at both, is somebody likely to be infected? And also at, are they likely to get very sick if they are infected? So you look both at exposure and at risk conditional on exposure. And then increasingly, there's evidence that vaccines are preventing transmission to some extent. And so you'd also want to consider, is somebody likely to get others sick if they do get infected? Then you also want to think about indirect benefits. So at times when hospitals have been overwhelmed, there's been shortages of groups like ICU nurses, that's going to be something that's relevant as well to benefit maximization. Similarly, if you have people who are caregivers for others who don't have other sources of care, very young kids, people who rely on caregivers for assistance with essential activities of daily life, people in nursing homes, the indirect effects of vaccinating or otherwise protecting those caregivers is also going to be relevant, again, even just to maximizing benefits before we think about equity issues. There are different ways you might interpret this idea of equity. So one is that people prominently advocated sort of early on in the pandemic, as people said, well, because of concerns about fairness with other approaches, let's just use a random lottery. Others said, let's use first come, first served approaches. I think, and I'll talk about this later, there are reasons to be worried about the justice of both of these approaches, which I describe as sort of equity through sameness of treatment. Instead, I think it makes more sense to think about equity in terms of giving a priority to people who are less advantaged. And then the question is what it means to give priority to people who are less advantaged or to those who are worse off. So there are different interpretations of this idea of being worse off or less advantaged. One is that you might prioritize people who are the least healthy right now. Another is you might prioritize people, and we'll come back to this when we talk about age and vaccine allocation, people who are at risk of dying early in life if they're not assisted. Yet another group, which I think sort of overlaps with some of these that I've talked about before are people who are subject to oppression and discrimination. We also know, of course, that these factors tend to lead to you being less healthy, being at more risk of dying early. So there's an overlap between addressing these and addressing reducing disparities and giving priority to people who are subject to oppression or discrimination. So here is my, this is a little bit polemical, but the sort of contrast between this sort of these superficial sameness and the priority to the worst off approaches. On the left side, you see people, you know, in lawn chairs. You might think, oh, fun, they're at a concert. They're not. They're older people, I believe in Florida, this is from the Tampa Bay Times, camping out overnight in a first come, first served line for COVID-19 vaccines. So one reason to be concerned about these sorts of sameness approaches is that, especially for first come, first served, they turn out, A, to not affirmatively address disparities, but also not even really to be the same. If you have the health status and the time to be able to camp out overnight, you're more likely to be advantaged. You don't have a grandkid at home you have to take care of. You're not somebody who is going to get really sick if you are just out all night overnight. On the right side, we have South Carolina map looking at counties by the social vulnerability index and trying to prioritize vaccines to counties that are more vulnerable. And more recently, some folks who developed critical care protocols, Bernie Lowe and Doug White, suggested that you might also use SVI, the CDC index that's used for vaccine prioritization that's been suggested in this map. You might also use that for prioritizing other things like critical care treatments. Some states have used this as one factor in prioritizing access for therapeutics like monoclonal antibodies. So these sorts of more intentional efforts at prioritizing the worst off, I think, are preferable to the sameness of treatment approach. So let's turn to a few different practical challenges in implementation here. One is the sort of proper role of age in allocation. So one interesting phenomenon is that many states ended up eliminating the use of age even as one factor in critical care resource allocation, where age would have generally prioritized patients who were pediatric patients or who are younger. But at the same time, states now have turned toward using these pretty blunt age cutoffs to allocate therapies and allocate vaccines that preferentially allocate them to adults who are older. And there are good reasons why you might consider age as a factor for therapies and vaccines, because risk of death if you're infected rises with age. Age cutoffs for vaccines do better at benefit compared to ignoring age completely. But these cutoffs also, as I'll talk about next, have the bad consequence that if you just use age cutoffs and you ignore other sources of risk, you end up exacerbating in really serious ways racial disparities and other kinds of disparities, including disparities based on some disabilities. So this is a headline from, I think, a really important article in ProPublica that I would encourage folks to read. The headline is, "People over 75 are first in line to be vaccinated against COVID-19. The average Black person here doesn't live that long." So if you set this blunt age cutoff, you end up disproportionately excluding people from certain groups that, as the prior speaker talked about, have been disproportionately harmed by the pandemic. And that age-based exclusion doesn't just hit Black populations, also Native Americans, Latino Americans. The CDC study suggests that the average age of death in minority patients has been about a decade earlier. And so if you use these age cutoffs, you end up having these disparate effects. Another category that ends up getting excluded if you use age only, has been debated a lot in California, is you end up excluding people with life-shortening conditions like Down syndrome as well, if you just rely on age. So one alternative suggestion that I've thought about is it might actually make sense if you're going to use age as one factor to allocate vaccines or therapies, which is going to tend to widen disparities. This actually strengthens the case for using age as a factor in allocating critical care resources. If people are getting disproportionately excluded from vaccines and therapies because they're high risk, but they're under a given age cutoff, then maybe they should have preferential access to critical care resources. So for instance, 78% of the very youngest COVID-19 deaths have been patients from minority groups, even though it's the reverse. You have more like the 22% who are minorities in the US, but 78% of those earlier deaths have been in minority groups. Another practical challenge has to do with individualized judgment. So many critical care allocation protocols got rid of what were called categorical exclusions of people for various disabilities. But these individualized scores might not be very predictive of actual outcomes. For vaccines, people have suggested the reverse. They've said, include everybody who, say, has a BMI over a certain level, whereas developmental disabilities. These have been proposed, but again, as I mentioned with California, not always adopted. Interestingly, in a recent piece in, I think, JAMA, a lot of states have used what's called the SOFA score for critical care allocation. One article, others have suggested different things. This more recent article suggests that actually the SOFA score doesn't predict mortality that well for COVID-19 pneumonia. Actually just using age, excluding people who are older categorically maybe, or using it as a factor would be better than using SOFA. So that's an interesting finding from the JAMA study. But the more general practical challenge is we might wonder, should everybody with a given risk factor be prioritized for vaccines, or should we try to make judgments that are more detailed or individualized? What evidence about a risk factor is needed in order to make a prioritization decision? And should different norms apply to vaccine than to critical care prioritization? So I think a lot of people would regard it as inappropriate, for instance, to deprioritize people with a BMI over a certain level for critical care. Is it different ethically to say everybody over a certain BMI is automatically prioritized without an individualized judgment for vaccine prioritization? So I'll go ahead and stop here, and I'll look forward to your questions in the discussion.
Excellent. We're going to roll right into our last speaker. Go ahead, Michael.
Great, thank you. I'd like to start out with a big thank you to my co-panelists for their excellent presentations, to my co-authors for their contributions, and to the Solomon Center and the Petrie-Flom Center for co-sponsoring this important event series. Now, before I begin, I really have to acknowledge the 500,000 people in the United States and the nearly 2.5 million people worldwide who have died as a result of COVID-19. This important work, mine, and I think I speak for all the co-panelists, continues in their memories. This is a transatlantic collaboration, and I will therefore be comparing approaches in both the United States and Europe throughout my talk. So we start with the premise of emerging infectious diseases, and with any EID pandemic comes an urgent global need to develop new diagnostics, therapeutics, novel medical equipment like PPE, tracking systems, software applications, and of course, in this setting, vaccines. Now, even though federal governments have already spent billions toward research and development, almost every aspect of the COVID-19 response involves some sort of exclusive rights. These are often given to private corporations to reward innovative research and development. And so patents are generally seen as the primary obstacle to widespread access of these innovations. And that's why you see entities like the World Health Organization's COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. So patents cover new technologies like the mRNA vaccine platforms that produced the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Moderna in particular reports having over 100 patents in various jurisdictions covering their technology. And this is similar for other mRNA vaccines and candidates. Other potential patents in this space for new molecules like monoclonal antibodies, we know with our experience in the United States and Europe that biologics tend to have a larger patent portfolio than small molecule therapeutics. We have new therapeutics like remdesivir, for which, since it has been approved in the US, we have more information about its patent portfolio. And then we think about new methods of use patents for COVID-19 for existing therapeutics if they're studied in those populations. And so importantly, we note that multiple patents can protect a single invention. So looking at remdesivir or Veklury, there are 8 patents that are currently listed in the FDA's Orange Book. The latest expires in 2038. There is a patent for method of use in treating COVID-19, which expires in 2036. And because the product was FDA approved in October of 2020 in the United States, there's a 5-year exclusivity period running through October of 2025. But there are some important caveats to patents. First of all, patent pools often depend on voluntary participation by manufacturers, and so you're unlikely to get 100% buy-in. The second, and I think something that may be more relevant in the US than in Europe, but technology transfer in the US applies to federally funded projects. For example, those products that are developed under Operation Warp Speed. And historically, the NIH and other federal agencies have been reluctant to pursue fair pricing clauses as a condition of licensing agreements. And so what you've seen are the manufacturers setting prices for their products, in some cases quite high. Technology transfer also does not condition licensing on participation in patent pools. And so there's no requirement that once a manufacturer takes federally developed technology or information and produces it and disseminates those products, there's no requirement that they have to participate in any sort of patent pool or other sharing agreements with other nations or other entities. Importantly, patents are exclusionary rights, and so they're not truly exclusive rights. And I'll go into the difference between that shortly. Patent protection also often varies by jurisdiction. And so that means that based on allowed claims and allowed patents, the portfolio for a given drug or therapeutic or vaccine in the United States is going to look very different than that same portfolio of patents in Europe. Patents are subject to agency review and invalidation, either by the issuing agency themselves or by the courts. The other thing to note is that the patent clock begins running as soon as a patent is issued. And so that does give us a window of time for exclusionary rights. But it's also important to note that many filed patents remain pending and have not been issued. And so transparency as to full patent portfolios is likely lacking. On the contrast, we started writing about regulatory exclusivity. Why is this? So regulatory exclusivity focuses on guaranteed periods of market exclusivity that are awarded by both the Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency. So these regulatory exclusivities cannot be invalidated like patents can. And perhaps more importantly, they also provide a guaranteed period of data exclusivity. And so my chapter with Timo Minson and Sven Boston of the Center for Advanced Studies in Biomedical Innovation Law, or CBIL, at the University of Copenhagen, focuses on the role of regulatory exclusivities on cost and access to COVID-19 related innovation. So really quickly, a bit of background on the differences between the two systems. In Europe, they have what is known as an 8+2+1 regulatory system for all approved products. So this means 8 years of data exclusivity, 10 years of market exclusivity, or 8+2, and then 1 additional year of additional market exclusivity for exceptional therapies. And this term is very carefully defined in the statutes. So this 10-year period is awarded irrespective of product type. And generally speaking, new formulations of existing drugs are not eligible for additional periods of exclusivity. Now in the US, by contrast, market exclusivity periods vary depending on product type. And so small molecules generally get 5 years under the Hatch-Waxman Act. Biologics get 12 years under the BPCIA. And there are also periods that vary based on indication. So for example, under the GAIN Act, certain antibiotics receive 10 years. New formulations of existing drugs are eligible for new periods of market exclusivity so long as they apply for new authorization from the Food and Drug Administration. Data protection tends to be shorter in the US, so generics and biosimilars can start applications after 4 years. When we do these comparisons, we acknowledge but generally exclude the discussion of orphan drugs, over-the-counter switches, patent term restoration, and pediatric exclusivity periods, which exist in both the United States and the EU, but aren't as directly relevant to COVID-19. So these latter two are considered supplementary protection certificates in Europe. But it is important to note that some of these products may be eligible for pediatric market extensions, and remdesivir, in fact, obtained an orphan drug designation in the US before it returned it after considerable public pressure. Now, market exclusivity runs continuous with patent exclusivity, and generally speaking, patent exclusivity often outlasts market exclusivity, both in the United States and the EU. So what does this all mean for COVID-19 vaccines? Now, we know that there are several extremely promising COVID-19 vaccines that have been or are soon to be authorized for emergency use, but have not obtained regulatory approval. So this means that millions of doses have been administered in the US and the EU, with billions of dollars in profits to manufacturers due to advanced market commitments at fixed and perhaps in some cases lightly negotiated prices. Now remember that patents begin running upon issue and exist in multiple jurisdictions, but regulatory exclusivity periods have not yet begun for some of these products under EUA due to COVID-19. And that's simply because they have not applied for or received regulatory approval. So it's important to keep in mind that emergency use authorizations, or EUAs, last until the public health emergency ends. And so that's an endpoint that is defined by health authorities, including the Secretary of Health and Human Services in the United States. This time frame, this notion of public health emergency ending, is about the same time period that companies are publicly promising to reasonably price therapeutics and vaccines. And in fact, we've seen in other conditions like Ebola that EUAs can actually be extended for fairly long periods of time. And so there's no substantial pressure on manufacturers necessarily to pursue full licensing in some cases. Their products are being widely disseminated, they're reaping the benefits, and there aren't as many expectations in terms of post-market surveillance, in terms of follow-up studies, phase 4 studies, and that type of thing. So again, these are billions of dollars of revenues before the regulatory exclusivity periods even take effect. We're noting that federal governments are often paying twice in many cases because they've substantially funded early research and development into these products. In the case of Operation Warp Speed, poured billions of dollars into the development, for instance, of the Moderna vaccine. And then they're paying, so paying twice is essentially once for that research and development, and again for the sticker price on the final product. And it's important to think that, realize that unpatentable products, or products that are already on the market, can also obtain regulatory exclusivities in certain situations. And so these are products that we would deem really not to be worthy of exclusivities because they've been around so long, but regulatory exclusivities can be applied, especially in the United States. So what does this mean for global access? So we know, we've seen from experience, the US and the EU have substantially greater purchasing power and the ability to pay full price. Other countries are going to be unable to acquire these products, these vaccines, at an affordable price, I'm afraid. And so we've seen comments from politicians in other countries suggesting that richer countries be encouraged to donate 5 or 10% of their supply. But this is really far less than what is needed in these countries, because we have to keep in mind that there are over 2 billion people in low and middle income countries in the world. Compulsory licenses can occur via government patent use in the US, Section 1498, and via the TRIPS agreement. But these tend to be deeply unpopular and would require either a waiver or deferral of the regulatory exclusivities that I've described. Deferring these regulatory and data exclusivities would require statutory change. And then upon eventual regulatory approval, data and market exclusivity protection may decrease incentive to lower prices in the long run. And so we really think that what is missing from the big argument about patent pools and expanding access to technology and innovation is this fixed system of regulatory exclusivities that will serve to prevent access in particular to data from some of these innovations moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And we're going to go right into Q&A. So, wow, do we have excellent questions already lined up? I'm going to invite the other speakers to turn their videos on as we go right into it. I'm going to start by combining a couple of questions we got, one from Kermit Kubitz, one from Professor Saver, and one from Dr. Finns, well-known friends of the center. And it's for Govind. And Govind, let me put the questions together this way, is to say there's a real trade-off between doing it perfectly and actually doing it in terms of pragmatics. And so you're getting a bunch of questions about the relationship of the perfect and the good, whether it's the use of the SOFA scale versus other kinds of scales, whether it's the idea of changing things midway through, whether it's the need to kind of be nimble. And I guess I'm curious if you have thoughts about the needs and the flexibility and how much slack ethicists should or should not be giving policymakers in this space. That's a fair amalgamation of a few questions. I'm going to keep answers to about 2 minutes.
Great. Yeah. So in terms of I think the speed versus equity trade-off has been pushed a lot in the vaccine discussions. And I think policymakers should be held to account for ways in which the choices they've made have created unnecessary trade-offs in that space. So, you know, in terms of slowing things down, the example I always give is that, you know, compared to first come, first served, there's no way that it slows things down more to give priority access when there's not enough to people in more vulnerable areas. That's politics, not speed. When you have really severe scarcity, giving priority access when you have more people eligible and there's vaccine, there's no trade-off there. It's really, in my view, that policymakers don't want to be seen as making people in wealthier areas wait. I do think there are trade-offs when you try to get into some kind of very detailed verification system. Like New York, for instance, ran into a lot of slowdowns because they were trying to have these very long forms to verify people's eligibility. So I'd say eligibility determinations, those can slow things down. I don't think when you have much more demand than there is supply, that prioritizing in some way by disadvantage is inefficient. In fact, it sort of better gets your scarce supply to where it both achieves equity better and also achieves more benefit. I've said in other places, you know, if you give a vaccine to somebody who's you know, exposed at work and is medically vulnerable, as opposed to giving it to somebody like me who works at home, that's not just equitable, it's also efficient. Glenn, I don't know if I have more time for Professor Prince.
You don't, so stop there.
I don't. Okay,
that's perfect. Great. Thank you for asking. Rachel, we're going to go to you next. Sorry, we have only a few minutes. I want to get as many of these questions as we can. We've got a great audience. So Rachel, we've got a very sophisticated question by Christina Kim that I'm going to make it slightly simpler by saying the question is, outside of Operation Warp Speed, what else could have been done to speed up manufacture and innovation in the vaccine space? And in particular, interested in kind of the ways in which the mRNA modality and the new platform complicates the picture or doesn't complicate the picture. So go ahead, Rachel.
So one thing I do want to note is that Warp Speed wasn't just about money. It was also about practical and logistical support. And so there are these really great anecdotes in a New York Times piece, which I can make available, about Moderna and how Moderna, which had not brought a product to market before, leaned really hard on the Department of Defense expertise in Operation Warp Speed to do things like go find a part that they needed for manufacturing, which was on a train somewhere and that was caught in COVID shipping restrictions. And there were a lot of things that Warp Speed did to really help scale up some of the new mRNA platforms in that specific way. But also, I do want to say that and I see this in Christina's question, there's a comment about whether antitrust concerns may have precluded information sharing. That has also been true in the antibody context. And a number of companies have actually recently received, asked and received permission from the Department of Justice to share information about some of their manufacturing efforts. So all of that was sort of part of the process. It does seem that there are some real scientific bottlenecks to scaling up production faster than they already have. But I'm not, I think, enough of an expert to say myself whether those are real or how much they could have been overcome given the right incentives.
Great. So now we've got a question for Catherine. And Catherine, this is a question regarding the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the vaccine trials and how that should factor into our conception of what, first of all, I guess there's an interesting question about were those exclusion or inclusion criteria good in terms of generating real usable evidence, but also the interrelationship between these exclusion and inclusion criteria and the various compensation schemes that we have. So thoughts you might have on that one.
Yeah, I guess, you know, as I'm thinking about the inclusion and exclusion for the trials, I think, once again, one of the things that we need to be thinking about is we need to be very proactive. And that's one of the reasons why I'm suggesting that we should have a registry, because were so many people who were just coming out of the woodwork who were willing to participate in these vaccine trials. And they just couldn't get registered. They couldn't get access. And so if we would have a standing list of those people who are willing to participate in the trials and willing to share their data, then I think that would be very helpful for us moving forward.
Fantastic, incredibly concise answer. Thank you for that. We're going to ask now Michael Minha a question, which is maybe a pair of questions. One is about patent pools in pharmaceutical companies and the role for that. The other, I would say, is kind of maybe let's just call this a brass tacks question, is to say every conversation I have, any American politician who took a strong position regarding vaccine sharing of doses that we already have committed to us, I think would get voted out of office. How do we overcome the political dimension of this problem? So both or either, as you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think solving both problems ultimately could have been done early on through creative text transfer agreements. So thinking about asking for concessions on price, thinking about requiring DoD collaboration with Scale Up, a cooperation with other entities that produce vaccines that we've seen have been very expressed a strong willingness to help scale up and produce vaccine. If we had required those early on as a precursor, I think we would have seen scale up and we wouldn't be having these issues of scarce supply and whether or not we should donate certain quantities of vaccine to other countries at the expense of our own vaccination program. But I would love to hear the thoughts from my European colleagues if they have any insights as well.
European colleagues? You have to unmute yourselves first, gentlemen. Go ahead.
Sven wanted to say
yes.
something.
Yes, I mean, actually in Europe, we have a bit of a, as you probably have heard also in the US, a bit of an embarrassment has been going on with regard to the production and the distribution of vaccines, particularly the AstraZeneca debacle. Where we have now learned actually that, in fact, the agreement, the advanced purchase agreement with Europe was actually signed before the advanced purchase agreement with the UK, even though the UK apparently has received more vaccines than we have. Actually, one of the things that is quite interesting that Michael has touched upon with in regard of tech transfer is the biggest problem is in fact that there is no sharing of production technology. So fundamentally, all manufacturers have the same problem. They can't manufacture enough vaccine. Actually, it's the same in the US. But of course, they're too reluctant to share the technology with third-party producers. So what we do see, the only agreements that exist is like putting them in a vial. I mean, that's the agreements we have. So that there is an agreement with Sanofi, for example, and Sanofi can then put the vaccine in a vial. Well, obviously, that's probably going to save us a week or something in speed, but that's not going to give us a couple of billions doses extra, which obviously we badly need. We have the same problem now with the Indian SSC, the Serum Institute of India, which can't keep up with production, has now said, well, you know what, tough, but we're now going to only produce for India because all the others have to wait because we don't have enough vaccine. So the biggest problem seems to be reluctance to share technology, which is of course related to partly secret know-how and of course partly related also to the regulatory data exclusivity, of course, which would become moot if they would have to share their technology.
May I just very quickly add
Please.
in also, I think we also need to differentiate between different types of vaccine, and of course the more complex messenger RNA vaccines, for example, there we have the issue that Sven already pointed towards, is that for example, compulsory licensing wouldn't always help because you need the infrastructure, you need the know-how, you need the skills to produce these vaccines, and a lot of these capabilities of producing these and scale of production have been outsourced. For example, the Danish Serum Institute, for example. And that also shows that compulsory licensing is not always the answer. It depends on the situation. I mean, and the situation differs, of course, between what we have in Europe and countries in poorer parts of the world where compulsory licensing might be the only option.
Thank you, gentlemen. Govind, another question for you, and this is a normative theory, political theory question relating to what Norm Daniels, our old friend, might call an unsolved rationing problem. So I guess the question is, do you seem to take the position that there are clear right answers here, or maybe not, whereas I think someone more inspired by Norman might say this is a great opportunity for accountability, for reasonableness, and a little bit more of a deliberative democracy method. Do you have views on this question?
So my view, I think, is the same view as Professor Cohen's late, much missed colleague Dan Brock about this, which is that I think accountability it's important to have deliberation, but you have to have sort of ethical values that organize and structure that deliberation. So I'm not saying, people all have to adopt, Professor Prasad's answers from on high, but I think when you're having these deliberations, I had an interesting discussion about this in a different panel, you also have to, when you've seen some of the public deliberations about vaccine prioritization, people may introduce reasons that seem unacceptable. And to determine what kinds of reasons are, say, unacceptably discriminatory or ableist or what have you, you have to, in the end, sort of resort to some values that might be outside that deliberation. So I'm all for deliberation, but I don't see it as an either or.
Fantastic. Okay, now everybody gets to give me one tweet you want people to remember or to tweet out about your presentation. And we'll go in the order of production, if I can remember it correctly, which is Rachel, you go first. What would you like people to tweet out or to remember? Tweet length response.
The pandemic really demonstrated both the promises and the perils of our innovation policy ecosystem, and we can and should learn from them in the future.
Terrific. Catherine, you're next. And we won't count the characters, but just tweetish length.
Mine relates to policy, public policy. If you vaccinate to protect the community should have your back if you're injured as a result of that vaccination.
Fantastic. Govind?
Recognize that preventing the harms of the pandemic and treating people fairly might be more nuanced than they seem.
Always great to get the word nuance in a tweet. Perhaps a little bit of medium is the message. Michael, go ahead. Michael, did we lose you? Let's see. Well, maybe we'll go to one of your Michael.
Oh,
Nice
am I back? All right.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You're back. Look at time. So we'll get one from each. One from each side of the pond.
Okay.
One from Michael, one from Timo, and then we'll end up at Michael.
Great. So Patent exclusivities receive the majority of attention when it comes to technology sharing, but really regulatory exclusivity periods are stronger and more enforceable, and I think prevent access in a broader sense than even patents can.
Fantastic. And one last tweet from Denmark. Go ahead, Timo.
Well, licensing patents alone, if compulsory not, won't help. You also need to transfer the skills and the know-how and the infrastructure. Thank you.
Fantastic. Everybody in virtual land, please thank me in joining this amazing panel. And we hope you join us for our next session of this wonderful activity. And if you don't know about Petrie-Flom or Solomon Center, go right ahead and look us up. We'll see you next time.